Well, it's a pleasure to be with you here for our last time. It's our last meeting. That's not necessarily a pleasure, but it's it's good to be with you, and been a pleasure to be with you. And it is our last time together. I trust I will see. I've gotten to know some of you, and it's just been a delight to get to know you. And some of you I've seen and know from other settings. So I trust I will get to continue some of the relationships that we have either started here or have grown to know each other better here. And that is a gift to me, and I'm very sincere on that. And your willingness to read with me, probably one of my favorite books in the world, is a gift to me, that you're willing to read it with me. It's sort of like, and I may digress a bit today, if you all will indulge me with some personal reflections of why this is so important to me. So you've been generous on that front already with our time together. So I will share some things with you. It was a very important book, just because I thought it was a good book. I really think it's probably one of Wendell Berry's best, in my opinion. I value Berry's sort of social critiques and commentary in general in his nonfiction, etc. But some of his fiction, it can be a little bit variable. But I love his work all in all. But I really think Hannah Coulter is one of his best. So I always use it to introduce people to Berry when they're not used to his fiction. But first, I want to just outline a few sort of framing concepts with us, just to remind us of where we've been, why we've been on the journey we've been on, and then where we will wind up in some ways. And just to say that again, to hopefully to serve us to give the sort of a wind-up structure to what we've been saying together. So let's look at this notion of the entitlement of therapeutic individuals. Remember the first week we were together, where we're doing some of the conversation around technological utopianism, the presumptions of happiness that are going to come from science, et cetera, and some of the seduction, the phrase that I will use for it, the seduction of the therapeutic culture, and how I think it distorts both our understandings of religion and our understandings of medicine and healthcare. I think both are vulnerable to being distorted by this therapeutic culture and its presumptions such as technological utopianism. So I want to contrast that with all the critique that's there that I don't want to be redundant about this morning, with a notion of what would it look like to a community of human flourishing, gratitude, hospitality, belonging, the nurture of communities of human flourishing, and how that I'm proposing to you is a better way to think about religion and health, versus the seduction of the therapeutic culture and its illusion of using religion as some sort of spiritual technique, just like any other mechanistic model out of contemporary medicine. And that I think it will disappoint us just like all the others, because we will still die. We will still be sick. We will still suffer. And so if we start to think, oh, well, religion and spirituality is going to be some tool or technique that we're going to use in some way to manipulate ourselves, and fundamentally, I would propose to you, if we're not manipulate God, if we start to think we're going to do, then we've become misguided. We've lost our way. But based on some of the things we talked about early on, just to remind you, there is an important relationship, I think, between religion and health. But it's how we understand it. And it's the framing of it that makes all the difference, I think. And so that's where we have been working the last 2 to 3 weeks, in this frame of the notion of what does it mean to think about, and the word is so overused, but a community, and particular communities. And remember, we rightly talked about last week, brought up by, excuse me, one of, I have used the mafia as my example in the past, but one of you guys mentioned gangs so appropriately. Gangs are you can have bad communities and good communities, right? But communities are powerful. I would want to propose to you that the notion of communities and context of persons who have joined together in the fullness of how we've talked about communities over the last few weeks, that's powerful. And it can have a positive or negative valence. So today, I want to two or three things, but particularly name and then discuss a little more in depth some of the particular characteristics of communities that I think form us in health. What are some of the virtues and the characteristics of communities that form us in health and human flourishing, and give us health and human flourishing? And then thinking about how do we grow to understand that? What's the best way to talk about that? And I'm going to be proposing to you how story, that we live by stories. I think we learn by stories. I think we're one of the great tragedies, in my opinion, of medical school is when, and we're trying to address this in some ways with some curricular work we're doing right now. I'm sure, as all of you, many of you I know come out of the academic context, and you know how everybody's always doing curricular revisions. I mean, it's kind of like, it's sort of this, I think it's like a fetish of deans to want to revise the curriculum. We're going to review the curriculum one more time, and we're going to revise it, and when frequently it can be so misguided, I think, and we get lost in our curriculum. But we do it all the time, all of us do. So we are in the midst, and my hope is that in some ways, the one we're in the middle of right now in the medical school will address at least some of the tendency to think that people learn well in just big lectures, where we just give them data and, okay, memorize this. No, we've all been in school enough to know there's some of that we have to do, right? There's just sometimes we've got to do that. That's part of the learning process. But I'm not convinced that that's really, and I'll use medicine as the context because that's the one I kind of live within and work within most of. I am not convinced that's how we learn to care for patients well. I love the title of a book just a few years ago, and there's been much written on this, but called Doctor's Stories. I think how you really learn to think about medicine and to think and really understand illness and how to think about giving treatment for it is to hear the stories of patients, the stories of those who we're working with. And one of my main criteria, a main criterion that I want to make sure a medical student masters and that residents really develop skills in is to be able to tell the story of a patient. Now, you might call that a case presentation, etc., but I really like the notion of encouraging them to, I want you to tell me the story about this patient. Because I want to see if they know them. I want to see if they know them enough to tell me a story about them, and if they know what is included in that, etc., etc. So today, in our context, one of the things we're going to be doing is we're using a story to help us get, just to talk about some of these issues that I think are important. It's one way. It's not the only story by any means, but it's a way of trying to have asked you to read it. And if you didn't have a chance, I understand. But those of you who did, hopefully will have some sense of why this story might have something to do with health and human flourishing. I would propose Hannah Coulter understands human flourishing. And that's in the midst of being someone who has been at the stage when this book is being written. She's been widowed twice. She lost her mother as a young one. I mean, if you just take the facts of Hannah Coulter's life, you could say, oh, how does she do it? But it's a story of human flourishing, I would propose. So we're going to be talking, so when we're in this contrast of the entitlement of therapeutic individualism in the therapeutic culture, and then this context of gratitude, hospitality, and belonging in communities of human flourishing, I want us to, we're going to be looking at some of the characteristics of those types of communities in particular, with some emphasis on one especially, and then thinking about the notion of why stories are important for helping us to think about forming communities and to inform us about, because I promise you, in my opinion, I mean, you can say more, but many of you, again, have been involved in education. But if I've got a list here and some things like that, but what you'll really, you won't remember that. I promise you won't. You won't. I understand. I put it up, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but you won't remember it. But what you will remember, hopefully, are a couple of ways I want to get at it through a story. And we're going to use one, the story of Ruth, a story that many of you know from the Hebrew Scriptures. And then we're going to use the story of Hannah Coulter. So hopefully that which you would never remember from just having Keith listed off, maybe, and it'll hopefully give us an example of why these particular stories help us to remember what might be important about religion and health at this intersection, and what really truly I think may give us human flourishing and health in this context. So in the list component, just to get us started, virtues of communities formed in practices of caring. I've shared this with you once before, and I just want to give you the list, and then we're going to keep going. But important notions that I think that I want us to look at in more depth: gratitude, acceptance, hope. I'm kind of lumping those a bit. Hospitality, sense of self-forgiveness, trust, belonging, and commitment. So all of these, I think, are characteristics that are virtues that are part of communities formed in practices of caring. And important for us to think about if we're going to start to really grapple with the notion of religion and health in a way that is, I think, in contradistinction to some of the work of the last couple of decades that I think are part of the distortions of both religion and health. So in this I want to say communities of caring, yes, memberships. Memberships, and you're going to hear me using that word a little bit more today. Those of you who had a chance to read Hannah Coulter know what I'm talking about in some ways, but I'll try to develop it a little bit more for those who haven't had a chance. But the memberships, it's an interesting word that you would have actually seen in Barry's talk about health is membership. It's a very important notion for Wendell Berry, the membership. And go back to when we've talked in recent weeks about belonging. And there's a lot of different, and sometimes I'll use the word membership plural. I think, and you guys you described this well last week when we took some opportunities to describe. There are a lot of different memberships in our lives, a lot of different ways we have community, a lot of different places you belong. But fundamental to what I'm saying with regard to, I do believe, and remember, go back to our gentleman that went back to the island off of Greece, Icaria. He belonged there, didn't he? He had a way of belonging, and people there belonged in a way different than I fear we do frequently. So this notion of membership is very rich, in my opinion, and very textured with the idea of a place of belonging, of understanding of understanding self, and of fostering an understanding of self that we might not have other. So it's a crucial notion, and we can look at it from a lot of different angles. But I just want to remind, I like it because it's a little bit different than what the standard language we use day to day. And so I think Barry's sort of challenging us by using it to say, okay, what are my memberships? And not just where you start writing a check, okay? That does not qualify for membership, okay? You may get a card, but it doesn't mean you're truly part of a membership. But communities of caring, memberships. I think communities of caring are memberships a la Berry. Challenge the illusions of a therapeutic culture seeking to use spirituality as an instrumental tool of healthcare. They cannot be created out of nothing. They require an ongoing commitment to certain virtues and are formed through patterned disciplines and practices in the context of an ongoing story. If we're going to think about formation of communities of caring in some way, if we're going to think about membership and take it seriously, and remember, I'm proposing membership is not just a nice thing. I'm proposing that membership does make a difference ultimately with regard to our health and human flourishing, and particularly certain types of communities and memberships. Okay, and so we want to think about what are the particular types of communities in which that would occur, and what forms them, what makes them, and what are the characteristics of them. Within those, for those to be operative, for memberships to make a difference in our lives, I think we do have to be known within them. And this is going back to I've mentioned Palmer to you once before. but the notion of knowing and in its fullest, most robust sense, loving. To know and to love. Again, that's what I was meaning a while ago when I was kind of saying just, the importance for those who haven't had a chance to read Hannah Coulter. Membership is so much more than, I've sent my check in and I've got my membership card. Membership is a way of life in a community of people. And it's talking about knowing and loving, of what it means to know and love, and how that's involved. And if you, and in Hannah Coulter, I think when Barry talks about a room of love, and for those of you who might have read it, you might remember, we'll go, but I encourage you to look back at that, and we'll look at a quote out of that. But when he talks about the notion, how she and Nathan found a room of love, but within the fullness of the membership of Port William, how there was that reality. It means being drawn into personal responsiveness and accountability to each other and the world of which we are a part. So knowing and being known. And so then I want to propose to you that knowing and being known is fundamentally done with stories of one way or another. We tell stories, and sometimes we've talked some about small communities before, and some of the virtues in some ways. Of course, we all know that they can be full of gossip as well, right? So you might want to say, and that's nasty stories, but they're still stories by which we know one another, right? We are known by those patterns and those stories, and so I want us to again, using that frame for how we think about this relationship in religion and health and human flourishing, that it's storied lives that we want to talk about, that we want to think about together, and that I would propose to you the necessity of honoring the significance of storied lives if we really want to think about religion and health properly. There's got to be a connection there. There's got to be that sort of reality within the framing, rather than just some notions of a categorical 0-1 phenomenon. And these are particular stories. Stories that make a difference are particular stories. They're not just generic, any old stories. They're stories about the fullness of lives and fullness of what it means to be part of each other's lives. And again, thinking about the virtues that I listed earlier. If we're going to think about those virtues, I would propose that there are stories of seeking voice, redemption, and transformation. The notion of that these are not just, they're not gossiping stories. They're stories that they're giving voice, and when I say that, I should probably explicate that a little bit more. I want giving voice to the fullness of life with all of its suffering and yes, its pain. We have to have I think if communities and memberships are to form and transform in a way that is health-giving and fostering of human flourishing, they need to give voice to the inevitable suffering of the human existence and find a way to do. Now, I'm not saying, and I really want to be clear on this, because sometimes I think communities of caring in one way or another can be viewed as, everybody's just going to go wallow in their woes in some way. I don't think that's good. I'm not saying that. There's a difference, and you know this if you've done. There's a difference between that wallowing and the intentionality of giving voice to suffering. We've all seen the situations probably where sometimes people started to wallow, what I'm calling wallowing, and get lost in that. That's not helpful, I don't think. That's not the service of a membership. But I do believe the membership, the community, that community of caring is one where it allows the room, remember the Wurzbach quote where we talked about communities, it allows the room for there to be, to give voice to suffering and not be afraid of it. You know, one of the things that I've seen over and over again, and I think one of the challenges for us, is to not be afraid of suffering. We sometimes never think it's contagious, don't we? We never think, no, I don't want to hear too much of that because I might get it, right? I mean, and we may not really think that way logically, but I think we live that way sometimes. It's nearly like, if we feel like proximity to those who are suffering will some way, it will drift to us. And what a disservice to them. What a disservice to them. And if we're living in a membership together, we can't live like that. A membership compels us to, in my opinion, to be able to allow voice for those who are suffering and not be afraid of it, not be fearful of, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get their suffering some way. And I think one of the things that, and we'll talk some about, or at least allude to some of the pieces around grief, but one of the things with grief sometimes is, I am convinced and I understand, the world as a whole can sometimes can you move on? Because this is too hard. The message sometimes that the folks around someone who's grieving can be giving is, you need to move on for me. I can't tell, because sometimes it's like, what if I start to really realize what your grief means? Because really what sometimes someone else's grief can mean is, we too will lose someone. We too will have loss. And that makes us afraid. We get afraid because we live lives of sort of assuming, oh, it won't happen to me. And so we're hoping that we can, and that other person's experience can sometimes make us fearful of it being contagious. Yes, ma'am.
It seems like we need to give a period of grieving. Like in Judaism, they have what they call sit shiva.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. It's a wonderful practice, I think, of Judaism. I was actually talking recently with some friends about how I think the Jewish community gets grief and the living out of it together so much better than the community I know best, which is Protestant Christianity. I mean, the tendency of the last century's Protestant Christianity at times is, oh, we got to get that done quickly, and let's all play like it didn't happen. You know, I mean, first die away from us, go die somewhere else, and then, oh, now we've got to get you in the ground quickly or wherever you're going to go because we need to move on. And again, it's not, I'm caricaturing it, it's not done with hostility, but it's, I think, out of those fears of, because if I take too much time with this, I may remember that I too will die. Or I too will be disappointed. I too will have loss. And what I would hope for, see, and gets back to the communities formed in the practices and virtues that I'm wanting to foster for us this morning: gratitude, hospitality, belonging. And so, if we get it as our memberships, then we won't be afraid. And we'll be able to give voice. And we'll be able to allow for the voice of those who suffer without fear. And then, by virtue of that, it will be a redemptive story. And then I think the potential for transformation across the membership is very powerful when we really get the picture on that. And I think that is health-giving. I think that, the article we read last week out of the New York Times Magazine, if we get it, if we really read carefully with it, it's basically acknowledging that there's something that adds about 10 years onto people's lives that in so many ways is about having that kind of community where people are formed and transformed because they love one another, because they give voice to one another, because they even dance together, right? They push the chairs back and they dance together. Okay. So, a story that I want to share with you, and please believe me, I'm totally intimidated to even talk about anything out of the Hebrew Scriptures with Jim Crenshaw here. But I am going to venture into dangerous territory with all the acknowledgments that I'm just a shrink talking about a story. Okay, and what I'm asking you to do is enter into the story with me. Not with all the sophistication of the thoughtfulness Jim could be, but for a minute, put that aside. Enter into a story with me. Read a story with me. a story that you know that many of you know, the story of Naomi and Ruth. And I just want to walk through the basics of it. And you've heard it, many of you have heard it all your lives, but some of the images that I want to share with you, I think I love out of this text that a colleague and her friend put together for us. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters." This is after, basically, Naomi has lost everything. Naomi has lost her husband, her sons. I mean, we talk about loss and grief, etc. Naomi's lost everything, and she's in a foreign land. She's not at home. She doesn't belong. She doesn't feel like she fits in. She feels very alienated, but then her daughters-in-law are saying, "We'll go with you." Naomi's going to go back to her homeland, and they're saying, "We'll go." And she's like, "Turn back, my daughters." She's, in essence, and I'm making up all my notions here, but I'm saying, I have nothing to offer you. I have no money. I have nothing to give you. You don't want. It's in essence saying, you don't want to be with me. I am suffering, and I don't want you to catch my suffering. But Ruth, and I do like this image, this woodcutting with these big hands. I think Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me." Now, this is a statement of, you feel you don't belong, Naomi. You don't have a place in this world. I'm going to bear witness to you that you have a place with me, and I have a place with you. We belong together, and we will be together, and I can hear your suffering, I can experience your suffering with you, and I'm not afraid of it. You have a place of belonging. And there's a lot of different ways that memberships can express that. A lot of different ways memberships can, and we've all had times when we've yearned for somebody to say that to us. We've yearned for someone to say, "I'm not afraid of your pain, and you belong, and I will be with you. I will bear it with you." Nicholas Wolterstorff has written a little book called "Lament for a Son." It's very easy to read. It's a quick read. I think it's one of the most powerful stories out there. To basically, it tells the story of the death of his son in a climbing accident when he was a young man. And Wolterstorff is basically sort of a philosophical theologian. He was at Yale for many years, etc. But this book, this is not philosophy and it's not high theology. It's a book about suffering, and it's a book about loss of a young man who he loved dearly. And in it, Wolterstorff talks about how people out of his communities would come and say all the things we all know that people say, meaning well, trying to. And Wolterstorff nicely narrates the notion of what he really wanted was people to sit by him on the morning bench. Just sit with me, be with me, belong with me. So belonging, the central notion of belonging. So many different ways we can narrate it. But I want you to have this image of, no, Ruth is saying to Naomi, you do belong. You do belong. And a story to say that. And so Ruth does go home with Naomi, goes back with Naomi, and is willing to be in proximity and live with. And so they go. And Boaz is a person of some stature in Naomi's homeland. And Boaz gives them basically roof over their head while they negotiate making a way back in Naomi's home country. And Boaz answered her and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me," talking to Ruth, "all that you have done for your mother-in-law." He's just chronicling, he's basically saying, I've heard how good you've been to Naomi. I've heard that you care for Naomi. And in the midst of the loss of her sons and her husband, you have said, I will care for you. I will be part of the membership with you. And then this image, I love this image of Boaz. Does he stand over Ruth and tell her, good woman? No, thankfully not. He kneels in front of her, and he's saying, I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get and drink from the water jars the men have filled. I think this is an image of hospitality. This is a powerful man in a culture that could have just not been respectful. But instead, he's kneeling in front of her and saying, I have heard good things about you. And I have heard, and I have told the men not to, I have told them to refrain from inappropriate behaviors, etc., etc. When you're thirsty, go and get drink from water jars. Hospitality. Belonging and hospitality. Two characteristics of communities. Trust, belonging, hospitality, welcoming. Two characteristics of communities that I think form us in health and human flourishing. And then the story goes on, and yes, Boaz and Ruth ultimately become married. And Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Now, when I look at this, and I want you to think, when I look at this image, I'm intrigued by how the person drawing it has Boaz and Ruth both sort of looking toward Naomi. But I don't know, I think Naomi's kind of like, fine for you all, great. What's in this for me? I mean, I'm still down. Life is not good for me. I'm glad you guys have each other, but life is not good for me. In many ways, I think Naomi's still captive to, you don't want to be near me. I'm still suffering. I'm still suffering. Fine that you guys have found each other, but I'm still suffering. But then, powerfully, there's a baby born. There's a baby born. The women said to Naomi, Praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. And we see Naomi smile. Naomi starts, and there's gratitude. Naomi starts to be able to name the gratitude in her life. Does this mean that the story of loss of her sons and her husband and her being left without much that did all that go away? No. That's still part of the story. And that's really important, my friends. It's really important we not get captive to the notion of, which I think the therapeutic culture and its technological utopianism and all the seduction that we've talked about with that, I think one of its great vulnerabilities is its impulse to think that, we can just erase the story of suffering and pain, and we've got a new happiness for you. We've got something that's going to displace that, and you don't have to name that any longer. That's gone. And there's a lot of different ways that we get caught in that. But I think we do. And do we want that? Yeah. I understand. We yearn for it in certain ways, but it's not real. That's not real. The story doesn't go away. The story is all still there for Naomi. But in the midst of that story of loss and a sadness and an awareness that there have been some real dips in the journey for her, there's a gratitude because there's a new part to the story. There's a new gift here I think it's a wonderful image for the gift of a baby. The gift of a baby is a new image. So, belonging, hospitality, and gratitude in the story of Ruth and Naomi. Naomi's transitions include her in that way. So, one of the things that I want to name with you. Yes, Ms. Judd.
My real name is Diana Judd. I changed my name to Naomi because of that story. Because I felt like I'd lost everything. Nobody in my family cares about me or even speaks to me. In 1990, 22 years ago, I was diagnosed by the Mayo Clinic with 3 years to live. And I found that the American Psychological Association has 8 characteristics that exist in a survivor. Number 1, for instance, is spirituality, a connection to a higher power. Number 2 was the support system. So I wrote my story, my autobiography, knowing that when I did a book tour, I could hear everybody else's stories. I did a tour of the United States, afterwards. They would come on my bus and share their stories. Today, I am a medically documented miracle. I am the body of evidence, the living proof, if you will, to what you're saying right now.
That's one, oh, thank you for that story. When I'm saying this, I'm not. So you really did change your name because of this story.
Yes, sir.
That's wonderful. Can I tell Pat? Can I use that in the future? Can I tell that story? Can I tell that story? I love that.
There are times when we feel like we have. I mean, just read my autobiography. They turned it into a miniseries even. But,
Well, I appreciate that. Well, I love that, and I think the power of those kind of stories are very real that we need to share with one another. Yes, Jim.
The reverse side of that, Naomi told them to change her name to call her Mara and not call Naomi, because Naomi means pleasant and Mara means bitter. So once she had lost her husband and her sons, and she was on her way back, and they greeted her as Naomi, and she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitter."
Well, thank you, Jim. And I mean, let's look. I mean, if you think it. Oh, sorry. Look at the on her face. Yeah, that's very, very telling. And thank you for filling in that gap. That is. Well, I mean, transformation is a wonderful thing, you know.
But when you have disaster, you can become bitter or better.
That's right. No, you're absolutely. But I think, what's powerful for me in this is, yes, okay. I mean, the reality is in her story, she would narrate as, oh no, Mora, is that bitter? Mara, bitter. Don't call me. You know, it's but yet, in the fullness of her story, I think the gratitude, the context that we're looking at, transformed, and the transforming potential, even when, and think about this with, I really appreciate that, Jim, of her sense of self, how it had been changed. Don't even call me by my name, because it doesn't have meaning for me anymore. You need to use a new name for me. I am so grieved. I am so saddened. I'm in so much pain. But yet, so the depths of what she was suffering, powerful. But the possibilities in the midst of that, within the membership, within a community that she's back in a setting where people are saying, no, you belong, and we love you, and oh, by the way, and delight with us. There's a baby that's been born. What a gift, right? We talk about children being gifts. The notion will come up again for us in our conversation of the gift. And then moving on to some of the Hannah Coulter story. We've seen Ruth and the images, and I want to share that story and the images with you as an example of stories by which we learn about communities that form us in the practices of caring. Communities that form us in practices of caring and our health giving, and how they invite us out and bring us all the things we've talked about over the last few weeks. Where Hannah says, another of the golden threads is gratitude. Those who read it, did you see the gratitude throughout the book? The theme of that, the power of that. And Barry, of course, weaves it in the fullness of a story, which is so much more than I can do here for you. But I mean, and I confess to you, I read and weep every time I read this book. And I admit that to you. And I keep thinking, when will I stop? When will I stop weeping? And I confess to you, and this is a little bit of a digression that I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, share with you of part of where this book became so. When I had read this book just in the few years before Patricia died, that I've told you about before, my first wife who died, and where I had read it had been, I had read it at the beach. And we go to Pawleys Island. Anybody know Pawleys Island? Or we go to Pawleys Island every year. You know, it's just I'm a rut kind of guy, and so we go to Pawleys Island. The kids have gone there all their lives, etc. And we go and I'm kind of boring too. We would sit at the beach and read. You know, we just enjoyed that. We enjoyed doing that together and this kind of thing. So we'd be sit at the beach, and we were sitting there, and I had. And regrettably, this story will tell you much about her and me, and me's bad, her's good, as usual, as it usually will. But so we're sitting there, and I'd finished reading it. We'd been at the beach, and I'd finished reading. She was sitting beside me reading, and I'm not exaggerating with this, but she was in the middle of a big book, and I actually think it was Middlemarch. That's just to give you the sense of how big a book it was. Okay, so she's in the middle of a huge book, literally dead in the middle of it, and I finish this sentence, and I just sort of say, great book, good book. And so, you know, we're sitting there, and a few minutes go by, and I just said, it was really a good book. And she knew me so well, and do you want me to read it? And of course I wanted her to read it. And forgive me if and the thing that I have lived with so much since she died was, and she did. She stopped reading her book. You know what it means when you're in the middle of a good book that you're enjoying? You want to keep. I mean, I know I do. She stopped reading that book to read this, so we could walk and talk at the beach. Now, I am gifted by a new wife that loves me very much, and I'm very thankful for that, okay? But for a long time, I thought, I can never be loved like that again. There's no way to be that. So that kind of love to say, I'll quit reading my book and read the book you've just finished that you love so we can walk and talk about this book. That's a gift. That's just to give you a little bit of a notion of what I mean when I'm talking about a gift. And I knew that was a gift. And that's still hard for me a little, okay? I'm not going to lie to you. I still miss it. I still miss it. I love Katie. She knows but she knows I miss Patricia. It's a complex world I live in, you know? And that's all right. We will navigate it. But that's the notion of that. I just want to give you a glimpse of when I'm talking about thanks. And the challenge, though, that I'm confessing to you, I am not talking about something that I take lightly when I talk about gratitude in the midst and the necessity of it for human flourishing. It's not always easy to come by. I honor that. So I'm not wanting to be perceived as, oh, Meador's just up there saying, you know, yeah, just gratitude. Yeah, what? No. I'm not saying it comes easily, but I am challenging all of us of the necessity. I propose to you the necessity of it for human flourishing, for the fullness of health and human flourishing. And I believe it comes in the context of membership in communities where we can learn with one another. And I think so when Hannah goes on to say, sometimes I was grateful because I knew I ought to be, sometimes because I wanted to be, and sometimes a sweet thankfulness came to me on its own, like a singing from somewhere out of the dark. I was grateful because I knew, even in my fear and grief, that life had been filled with gifts. Even in my fear and grief. Very important. That life had been filled with gifts. Right? Important notion. And again, it's not saying that, it's not denying the reality of all the losses Naomi had had. It's not denying any of those. But it's saying, I will a community that can give voice to the bitterness, because literally, I'm so appreciative to Jim for mentioning that she was saying, no, I have a new name because of my grief and sadness. I have a new name. A community that could say, come in, be among us, and then in the context of a gift and the gratitude to transform and transform. And then just a few sections here of quotes that I want to from Hannah Coulter. I love this one, and again, and an old woman sitting by the fire, waiting for sleep, makes her reckoning, naming over the names of the dead and the living, which also are the names of her gratitude. And yet their names and their faces and what they did and said are not gone, are not the past, but still are present to me, and I give thanks. That I could be an old man someday and say those words. And be able, I mean, you may think I'm already an old man. Some days I feel like I am too. But I have this image of myself that I'm still to become an old man, okay? So forgive me for that. I'm still, it's my illusion, okay, that I'm not. But that I would be able to, and I love when she's, which are the names of her gratitude. And this goes back to a number of things we've talked about over the week. Of central to the notion of health and human flourishing, I would propose to you, are people. Now, I love books too. We talked about, nowadays it's really what's your favorite website, and this kind of thing. But I love all, but I need people. And I believe for health and human flourishing, we need, and it's variable on numbers. I'm not talking about a particular number, but we need a membership. We need a membership. Some way, somewhere. That's where the health is in Icaria. That's why he's living longer. That's why we need to belong, and it needs to be a community of hospitality and gratitude. And for that we will give thanks, even in the midst, even when there's been loss. And that's health giving. And those are the names of her gratitude. The membership, the people that she narrates of. These are makes her reckoning, naming over the names of the dead and the living, to recall the membership, to be able to. I mean, it's a great gift when we can sit or go on a walk or ponder those we have loved and those who love us now. What a gift to be able to just to ponder that and tell the story. Central to, I think, what comes from this gratitude, this that I've proposed to you, is actually a necessity. Not simple, not to be derived in some simplistic notion of just go feel positive feelings. Remember, I'm challenging that. I don't buy the sort of just go feel positive feelings. We're part of real stories, real lives that need real memberships to help transform and transform them. But in that gratitude, that gratitude will give us a hospitable heart. Because we've talked about it over the weeks of the necessity of, and you guys have said it much better than I, of giving back. Of that, how you yearn, it's important to be giving back, to finding ways to give back, to do in a variety of contexts and settings. Well, that giving back, I would propose, is a hospitality. And the interwoven reciprocity of gratitude and hospitality is really important. If we understand, and I've said it before, but I'll say, if we understand that it's all gift, then we'll realize it's not ours to own, and we'll realize that I should invite others into the story, into the fullness of it. If we think it's all ours, that we earned it, and it's just ours to possess, then we don't understand, then we won't invite others into it. But if we understand that it's all gifts for which we give thanks, then we're going to say, welcome, come share with me. We will be hospitable people. So the hospitality is integrally related to the gratitude. And I think it forms us and transforms us in our membership. Taking that thread and then staying with Nowak, who I've mentioned to you once before, a mathematician and basically sort of an evolutionary biology and mathematician at Harvard, has noted that within evolutionary theory, if we get it right, that the fullness, and I won't, what makes us truly special, he's talking about as human beings, is that cooperation through indirect reciprocity, and this is the sort of cooperative, it's notions of how we inevitably, in a community and a membership, foster a cooperation and a reciprocity, propelled the emergence of human language and brought about a new mode of evolution. This is cultural evolution, which involves learning and explains why we are so devastatingly successful. This notion of that, and my sort of paraphrasing of that to make it is the notion of that membership lived out well is what really is why we have thrived. Where membership, we need membership to flourish. And when we have that sort of intricacy of the fullness of the indirect reciprocity that is part of a healthy membership, that's when we live well. That's why if you want to just take a rigid evolutionary perspective on it, that's where we flourish. That's where we come into the fullness of our own, and that's where we derive health and flourishing in that. Now, this is a long quote, and forgive me for that, but a young man that I work with once challenged me. He said, "You got to use this more." So I am. If you'll bear with me, I want to read through it and part of this is bringing us back around to the notion of health care in some ways. I talk about versions of this with younger folks who are in medicine, etc. I consider it a high privilege to be invited into the story of those who are suffering. What an honor and privilege for someone to say, "I will talk. Let me talk with you. Let me tell you my story. Let me tell you about my journey and my suffering." I mean, I'm honored by it, but we have to learn how to be part of that and how to be part of stories of sickness and stories of illness. Well, I use this to just frame that a little bit of saying life being, if you will, is a matter of being with. It is to know that we belong in sickness and in health, in flourishing and in suffering to God and to one another. It is to know that stewardship of each other's lives makes us, every one of us, debtors to every other one, because in every aspect of our lives and then in our deaths, we belong to God and to one another. It means we must take time and make room, understanding that being sick, and especially being with those who are sick or suffering, does not take time away from life. Rather, these are the things of life itself. There's a fullness in life when we can learn to negotiate membership, communities of caring and practice, to where we realize this is life itself. This is the honor, the privilege of human existence, to be present with those who are suffering and to actually engage them, to give voice and to hear the stories in a way that become redemptive and transforming. Now if we're part of communities and are formed in religious life and practice in a way that fosters that, that is health giving. And that does, and I do believe that it literally adds, I think it is the closest we're going to come to understanding why we have longer lives and decreased mortality. The associations that I've shown you early on in our time together that we epidemiologically, the epidemiological side of me believes and sees, and I know the data. But why? What's the mechanism? Why would people have longer lives, decreased mortality with cardiac illness, etc., because they're part of religious communities, etc.? I'm sorry, I don't buy that it's some sort of special prayer they said with standing on their left foot and leaning their head a different way. I don't think that's what it's about. I just don't buy it. I don't think that there's some technique for that. I think it's embedded in this. It's embedded in a life of belonging and being together and of believing together that there are particular ways of living that foster human flourishing and a life-giving within that. I want to use these three separate quotes from Hannah Coulter to talk about a little bit with you around the issues of grief and of just this, but it's really, that's wrong, I said that wrong, not the issue of grief, but the issue of the midst of suffering and gratitude. She talks about, we learn these things, and she's talking about gratitude there and the appreciation for some who've gone before. We learn these things by our grief, by our loss too. Remember the notion that, and again, to be careful, never to aggrandize loss and suffering. We used the Viktor Frankl quote early on about when Frankl talked about growing in the midst of our suffering, and that we become more psychologically rich and full in certain ways with our suffering. Now, remember, we don't have to go seek suffering. It'll find us, okay? I do not want to sound like a masochist in this. I'm not at all saying that. But as part of our human existence, we will have sadness, disappointment, suffering. We don't have to seek it, nor should we seek it. But it will find us. We learn through it. We learn these things by our grief, by our loss too. We don't go seeking it, but I think to honor that we learn through. I like the way he uses that, says that. Then when she's talking about Nathan, when she's talking about with their relationship and some of those of you who had a chance to read it, you'll remember, the degree to which Nathan, her second husband, who she lived most of her life with, after she would talk, he wasn't a man of many words. And Barry, I think, has wonderful ways of describing how he would, he didn't say things twice. You need to catch it the first time. But yet the intimacy of their exchanged glances at times. I love the way Barry would capture their relationship of how they knew each other. But again, not one of these. One of the richnesses of his description of their relationship is it's not some Pollyannish. And they're just always looking at each other with lovey eyes or whatever. No. It's a real relationship of they could be angry, they could have times when working, and he captures that well when they're trying to work together or whatever. But then the fullness of their love he captures well also. And what I was always reaching toward in him was his gentleness that had been made in him by loss and grief and suffering, a gentleness opposite to the war. He'd been in the Pacific Theater in World War II and never talked about it. Been in Okinawa, etc. But she knew he'd been formed by it. And the gentleness that had been made in him by his loss and grief. Again, the notion of that we are made different by our suffering. And not to be afraid of it, but more to think of how as a community do we incorporate it into the ongoing story in a way that will form and transform us for human flourishing. Then if you want to know why, even in telling of trouble and sorrow, I am giving thanks, this is why, when talking about the gratitude. If you want to know why, even in telling of trouble and sorrow, I'm giving thanks. I do think that's a challenge, but I think that's the claim on us. If you want to know why, even in telling of trouble and sorrow, I'm giving thanks. So the call on us for gratitude and to give thanks. Religion and health are best understood in the context of particular stories about particular people of faith and practice who care for one another with hospitality formed through gratitude for the memberships, the gifts of their life through which they have been known and loved. I think that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where we really grow to understand religion and health rightly. Through such membership and communities of caring, we find hope and human flourishing, even in the midst of the suffering, the loss, the grief, the inevitable disappointments of our human existence. Because I do think any efforts that are made in the midst of the therapeutic culture, and remember when we read Leon Cass's work around beyond therapy and the illusions of that, we will get past this human existence with enough sophistication, with enough genomics, with enough whatever, we'll get past that, and we will no longer suffer, and we might not even have to die. All illusions, I'm afraid. But that's not a reason for despair. And that's really important. That's not a reason for despair. The reality, I think there's possibilities here if we can capture our imagination enough around, if we can allow our imagination to be captured enough with these notions of what it would mean to be part of a membership and a community of caring in which to find this hope and flourishing that we've talked about in the past. And I end with a quote that with these hopes, where I would propose, and this is out of a book it was on philosophical psychology. It was not a theological book at all, and that's important. Drury is a psychiatrist who studied with Wittgenstein. So some would say one of the most significant philosophers of the last century. So, and this is out of basically sort of a dissertation of his. And it was at the very end of it, after a long work on philosophical psychology, that Drury comes to, and it's very poignant to me, that this is where he would end. And I share it with you at the end of our time together in ways, as to remind us that in sickness or in health, in sanity or in madness, in the vigor of youth or in the decrepitude of senility, God speaks these words which he spoke once to St. Augustine. Run on, I will carry you. I will bring you to the end of your journey, and there also will I carry you. You've been delightful. Thank you for the time we've had together. And we've got about 10 minutes to just talk together if we want. Yes, Ms. Judd and then Jim.
As a writer, I love words, so just like communities come in unity, to me, I've always thought intimacy is into me, you see, and alone is all one. But I just want to point out that the animal kingdom also has a community. The higher the intelligence, they grieve, they have reciprocity, they teach each other skills and have understanding and order. They're the great apes, the elephants, the dolphins, the bottleneck dolphins, the orcas, and the magpies.
I find some of the most poignant reading I've done in the last few years just when I read about elephants grieving. Very sad. Just powerful how they grieve. No, it's not. Jim.
I wanted to illustrate the importance of community and Wendell Berry. Recently I received a letter from him.
Please speak up, Jim, just so we can all hear you.
To illustrate the importance of community with Wendell Berry. Recently I received a letter from him in which he was responding to a poem I had written in my book, Dust and Ashes. And the poem and creation, God becoming vulnerable by creating and then creating human beings who would be willful, and that would bring suffering to God. And Wendell's response to me was, I think creation was out of loneliness, divine loneliness.
Say it again, Ray.
God created human beings and the world out of loneliness.
Divine loneliness. Thank you, Jim. Yeah. No, and that, I would build in on that, if you don't mind, a little bit. Just thank you so much. The notion of, then, desire for membership. That God literally would yearn for membership with us. And what an invitation for that kind of, what holy membership, what special membership. Yes, ma'am.
I belong to a group of Gilda's Club, and
Say that again.
I belong to a group, I belong to Gilda's Club, and that's one of the places that I have found that allows people to grieve, because often families won't let them talk about dying, or they will die knowing they're ill, and they do shun you for fear that they would catch what you have. Right. And it's a wonderful place because it allows people to cry, to curse, to whatever, and their feelings about their loss at that time. And I remember a very poignant thing that happened to me. I was fellow that lived in the same building, used to walk his dog at the same time I did, and when I lost my hair there, he would look away from me when he'd see me in the elevator. And finally, I told him one day, I said, you know, what I have is not catching and actually hurting my feelings. You can still joke around with me. I'm still here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And after that, he did speak, but it is a truth what you're saying is that because we fear and often just refuse to accept. I know I did when my husband and my daughter and I, that if you don't accept it, then it's not happening. And so,
But what a disservice to those who are suffering.
exactly.
What a gift it would be
Exactly.
to not be afraid. And that's where we need each other within. And that's where, I mean, and again, where I really do value Barry's work of giving the story of a community, a little people of Fort William who, I mean, Burley knows how to, you know, he's awkward feeling in a way, but he knows how to love people, even when they're suffering. Oh, don't you? Oh, how can you not love Burley? Favorite characters in Window. No, yeah. But I mean, how can you not love him? Yeah, I'm right. Thank you. Thanks for that. Yes, ma'am.
I had read counterculture a number of years ago, and I remember being entertained by it and thinking it was delightful. But I read it again at your insistence.
Thank you for indulging
And
me.
I have to say that this time around, probably because I'm older, and I've lived some more of these incidences in my own life, it meant so much to me. It was really powerful.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. I can, well, and I hope I haven't done a bad thing this past week. You made me think by mentioning the difference of maybe that age makes a difference. I realized, as I read and wept again, of I have a 24-year-old daughter who's a medical student here at Vanderbilt, actually, who's just, as you might guess, very dear to me, and she's a thoughtful young woman, etc. And I realized, and she loves to read. She loves to read, and I realized I've never given her Hannah Cole. I mean, you know, I've given her things to read. You know, I'm very invested, I confess, in her development and her thoughtfulness. But I thought, I've never shared Hannah Coulter with her. And so the other night, after I had to go pick her up from the airport, she was coming back. So I took her Hannah. I said, "Sweetie, okay, I know you don't have time right now. I don't know. When the holidays come around, whenever you want to do it. No pressure, no need. This is for you. I look forward to you with me." And of course, forgive me for reaching to her mother and all sorts of complex dynamics that I'm playing out in that. But basically, I yearn for her to read. But maybe she's a little young, so maybe. But we'll see. I hope I haven't. I hope she has. But thank you for sharing that. I'm glad that it wasn't redundant. That it was worthwhile to read it again. Yes, ma'am, Dolores. I love. By the way, I'm going to give a shout out for this woman of when we do share a congregation. Yeah. When she reads the gospel on Sunday mornings, it's just a holy moment. So I just had to name that, Dolores. It's a special time. So please go ahead.
It made me think how people used to shield children from death. And they would think that somehow they had been deserted or wondered by whoever died, especially relatives who wouldn't come back. And I have gotten this email a number of times, and every time I get it, I just almost break down and cry. But this little boy had sort of been out all day. When he came in, his mother said, "Where have you been, sweetie?" And he told me he had been next door. And he said, "Well, you know that Mr. Jones is really very sad because his wife died." And he said, "Yes, I went over there." And she said, "You did? What did you do?" And he said, "I climbed up in his lap." And she said, "Well, did you all talk?" He said, "No." She said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "I just helped him cry."
Now, and that's what we need. And I mean, all the varieties of that. What people yearn for. Whether we talk about it being on the morning, sit by me on the morning bench, or just curl up in the lap and help him cry.
Yeah,
Whatever. But he was what a wise young boy. That was a service.
And that's what we need a membership for, to be able to do those things. And there's all sorts of variety of ways it happens, you know? So many different ways. And it's not always emotional for those who are afraid of emotions. There's just all sorts of ways, I think. But we need memberships in our lives, and I am convinced that it is if you want a scientific mechanism by which health and religion are related, look for it in memberships in which we live, and the lives we have together that are formed through religious communities and faith practice. There's something there for us to learn about. I'm not going to hold my breath until we get it all figured out, but that doesn't mean we don't enjoy and delight in one another within the context of the memberships. And thank you. Yes.
Dr. Meador, on behalf of OLLI, I had the privilege of introducing you several weeks ago to this group to give this course. At that time, I didn't know or understand what a practical theologian, a person with a PhD in practical theology from Duke University, could offer. Now realize, after these weeks, that you have offered this group, and I'm sure many others, the knowledge of how to form a community for the nurturing of human flourishing. Your lectures have been enlightening, provocative, and enjoyable. On behalf of OLLI, I thank you very, very much for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're kind. Thank you so much. It's been good to be with you. I count you as friends. And if you see me somewhere and I'm lost and not recognized, knock me down and say, I'm so-and-so. You're my friend. So thank you.